and the few people benefited from it. The vast majority of India's labor force did not benefit from trade through the export of low-skilled services and the employment that that would have created. So this chart shows on the y-axis what is a country's share of the global exports in low-skilled goods. The x-axis shows what is that country's share of global workforce. And roughly the intuition is that the more laborers you have, unskilled labor, the more unskilled exports you should be doing. And the really stark contrast again is with China. China accounts for about 20 to 25% of the global labor force, but it accounted for almost up to 50% and still does of global exports in labor-intensive goods. And India accounts for having the same labor force, but about 3 to 4% of global export market share. And had India had achieved these low-skill exports to the same tune as its labor force, it would have had much more employment, much more exports, especially of informal manufacturing for larger swathe of its labor force. So economic precociousness had a cost in terms of lost employment opportunities. The other thing which I won't dwell upon, the other thing about precociousness is the kinds of policy choices we made. They were kind of unusually sequenced. India devoted a lot more to welfare before creating public goods like infrastructure, health, education. It did a lot more state capitalism before public infrastructure, as Girish just mentioned. And we know that in education, emphasized higher over primary, in health, population control and disease control over public health, sanitation, etc. So these were all precociousness with serious consequences in many ways. I'm going to skip it in the interest of time. Well, maybe not. So one thing we show is, if you look at state public enterprises, central public sector enterprises in India and state public enterprises as well. So for the first time, we believe that we compiled data from 1970, for about 50 years, and we calculate what the opportunity cost of these enterprises in terms of, had they made a decent rate of return, how much more would the government have got, and not getting that, what were the opportunity costs. And what we show is that if you combine the center and the states, the opportunity cost was about somewhere between 1.25% and 2.5 percentage points of GDP every year. Just to give it texture, if the state public enterprises had earned a normal return, state governments could have spent every year double the amount on health expenditure that they actually ended up spending. So these public sector enterprises had a huge cost. And what we explore in the book is, why is it that despite consistent over 70 years of serious underperformance, we never saw exit from these public sector enterprises? And we discussed that to some extent. Did we skip this? Okay. We can talk about it more in the Q&A. One of the really surprising and striking facts that we discovered when we were exploring the book is that we all say, oh my God, or many people say, oh my God, if only India could have grown as fast as China and for as long, which is true to some extent. But what is surprising is that 1/3 of India, which is the south, Gujarat, Maharashtra, and Haryana, did grow as fast as China and for as long. So this is a chart that starts the clock in terms of per capita GDP growth in 1980, and by 2020, the southern states, Haryana, are basically very close to China. So the question, in some sense, what it does is that the question is no longer need be, why doesn't India grow as fast as China? But why doesn't 2/3 of India grow as fast as the 1/3 of India, which is like China itself? So it gives it a different complexion on how we should think about different regions in India. Okay, so Devesh spoke about the fiscal part of nation building. Necessary part of nation building is richer states transfer resources to the poorer states, so that the citizen everywhere in India can have broadly equal access to public services financed by the government. Now, in this chart, what we were doing, who were the beneficiaries of that? So we divide India into 5 regions, and there are a couple of things interesting about this chart is that you can see that the biggest beneficiaries are the Hindi heartland and the East. So it's not just the Hindi heartland, also the East. But in terms of quote-unquote the donors, although all the political contentiousness has come from the South about how fiscal federalism is unfair, most notably, D.K. Suresh, D.K. Shivkumar's brother said, all our GST resources are being taken away. What this chart shows is that the biggest quote-unquote donors was not the South. Even today, it's not the South. It's actually the West and Haryana. So those are the biggest, donors. So the question is, why is it that the noise comes more from the South? And obviously, the answer is that it has to do with other aspects of what's happening in India, whether it's about political representation, whether it's about language, etc., etc. But the other thing that this chart shows is that, look, some of the discontent that's coming from the southern states on this issue is not because there are transfers. I think we're all Indians first and believe in that. But the problem seems to be that the transfers are steadily rising over time, open-ended with no limits, and these transfers are happening at a time when, or over a period of time, when those who are receiving this have been consistently underperforming, and those who are doing the transferring are consistently overperforming. So it's as if these transfers are creating bad incentives by not, at least disincentivizing bad performance. So there's a kind of moral hazard where I think that's maybe at the heart of what's the problem in the discontent. Not the magnitude of the transfers, but the rising transfers against the context of this differential performance, which is seen as creating perverse incentives. Last 2 slides. So we have in some ways, let me just go back. We say the magic and paradox of India is, of course, democracy. The under-recognized achievement is what Devesh said, how democracy became an instrument of nation building, an instrument of creating order, which are such fragile and such difficult things to do. And Devesh mentioned all the countries that were not able to achieve it, but also look around your neighborhood, you're not being able to achieve that. The delayed and partial success was the economic achievement and the state capacity achievement. The disappointment, of course, the durable disappointment has been, we're still lagging behind health, education, gender, and a true sense of fraternity between amongst Indians. The abiding irony we talk about is how democracy, which has done all these great things, has also imposed challenges. And we compared democracy to that line, liquid oxygen. Liquid is a जीने नहीं देता है और oxygen is a मरने नहीं देता है. So democracy has those qualities. And of course, we end by saying the looming tragedy is, all those lovely, great early achievements of pluralism, building institutions, a sense of, a common nationhood, those are now under threat. But I want to end on the economic and core economic and social achievements. What this chart shows is GDP per capita from 1950 to 2020, the average standard of living, as it were. We began, so this is as if it's for all countries in the world are in this chart. And a number like 79, India says, is 79 poorest country or 79 richest country. I.e., if one is the richest, 79 out of 100 is pretty much at the bottom. Over the first 30 years, our position amongst the world deteriorated even further. And then it went to 85. And then since 1980, with rapid growth, we've improved to 66, but we're still amongst the poorest 35% of the countries in the world, which tells you that when we look at how big the economy is, we should also look at what is the standard of living of the average person, and that's what the chart shows. And on a broader human development index, which includes education and health, our performance actually is even worse. We began at number 63 out of 100, we deteriorated to 79 over the first 30, 40 years, and now we've only barely caught up. We're still 69 amongst the poorest in terms of performance on Human Development Index. So that's kind of the broad story of the assessment, the paradox, the achievement, the success, the disappointment, the irony, and the looming tragedy. Thank you.
So the book, we absolutely made sure that we had no recommendations. Arvind and I talked along. We actually had drafted earlier thing about 50 pages and we chucked the whole thing. The book, not only because the book was so big, but everyone has a laundry list of what India should do, and there's nothing new that frankly we had. But we had just one, and that was do no harm. In a sense, it's almost a Hippocratic oath for the political leadership. And we used it in the sense of question, which is, as Arvind pointed out, if you receive a whatever Amazon package which has some glassware or china or whatever, it can say fragile and care. If you look at the history of nation building, not just in the past, but what's happening around the world now, I don't think we realize just how hard it is and how fragile it can be. And precisely like for that, we had this one recommendation that be very, very careful that some of these things, the various things about nation building, whether it's region or religion, that you have to be very, very careful. I think one of the fundamental, errors we make when we think of democracy, we usually reduce it to elections, which is a tragic mistake because it's much more than that. And more than anything, especially when it comes to the political leadership, democracy is also about a sensibility. It's a sensibility that the leadership thinks about compromise. And above all, it has a sense of self-restraint. As we've seen in the US now, no matter how strong your institutions, if at the very top, if you don't have a sense of self-restraint, then frankly, all the bets are off. So that was our only injunction. Now, I think it's fair to say if a significant part of your population is systematically excluded, it will have the consequences. Now, what the consequences are, how they play themselves out, is it's not easy to be a Christian with that, because it may well also be, and that's also the opposite, that there are political cycles, regimes change, but I think the more difficult question and the more sobering one is, what if this bigotry is not about politics, but is becoming a deeper rooted feature of Indian society itself? Because if that happens, that's much harder to look after. And I think that's the real danger. That if politics takes a particular turn and it becomes institutionalized within social norms, then I think the challenge is going to be much, much harder.
Just to, this was not a book about politics and things, so we don't dwell too much on that especially to except to mention this. Just also to keep it in perspective, what we're seeing in India is not happening uniquely to India. It is a global phenomenon where around the world, whether it's the US or the UK or Hungary or Poland or China or Russia, we're seeing this drift towards electoral authoritarianism or whatever it is. And I think just keep that not to downplay or exaggerate what's happening in India, but just to give a sense that there is something global going on. There are some common global factors here. For example, the rise of social media, which I think we should keep at the back of our mind even when we think about India. So that's kind of point number one. Point number two is when we say at the end, do no harm, all right? I think we say that particularly in the context of the major early achievements, which is democracy, nation building, etc. But there's a little bit more tangible dimension to this, which is the relationship between the center and the states, cooperative federalism. In fact, we end the last chapter we begin by talking about the Delhi air quality problem. And then we say that this is really a metaphor for India's problems writ large, because this is a problem that has so many dimensions, so many ways that we need to address. For example, it requires cooperation between the states that are the source of the pollution. It requires cooperation between the states and the center. It requires, for example, difficult agricultural policies like the overproduction of rice in Punjab that needs to be addressed, and that also needs cooperation in a number of ways. And it requires political courage to address the kind of subsidies that lead to this. There's also the regulatory challenge because all kinds of things are going on. So the point is that if we lose, if the over-centralization, etc., leads to a loss of trust, between the states and the center, then regardless of the challenges ahead, whether it's agriculture or power or renewable energy or land or health, all these things will require cooperation between the center and the states. And if we lose that in our polity, our challenges are going to become much more larger. The last point I would say is that if you look at the historical experience, in China most famously, lots of things can happen to institutions, and economic growth can kind of continue for spells of time, even with bad institutions, even with institutions being undermined and all this thing. But in India today, I do think there is a connection between what we're seeing in terms of social and political policy and the impact on even the economics, as it were. Just one example is private investment has been weak for a very long time. And this despite the fact that the government has provided corporate tax cuts, provided incentives, the banking system is willing to lend money to investors, there's a lot of macroeconomic stability, and yet the paradox is, why is private investment not picked up? And certainly one possible hypothesis is that the risks of doing business in India are still high because of the weaponization of the state and the weaponization of enforcement, which is creating uncertainty, the kind of tax terrorism that's happening, and the kind of playing field that is not level between all investors in India. So there are aspects to the kinds of things that you raised around on the social and political side, which Devesh has answered in those spheres, but they also have spillovers into the economic realm, which may not be felt immediately, but over a longer period of time could take that toll as well.
And the EDS. They do cover large. But of course, it's important to ask, are these palliatives? Or are they, in terms of the amounts, etc. Right? So in some ways, when you can provide the midday meal, but learning outcomes in schools are still pretty dreadful on average, right? That requires an attention to public goods in very different ways, and that is frankly, it was way worse in the first 40 years. I mean, there are no halcyon years when it comes to public goods. I mean, India did a terrible job, ironically, in the socialist space, of the very things that socialist countries are good at: public health, public primary health education. Right? The big push towards these actually comes around 2000, especially education. Of course, we can say it's quantity, not quality, but in the past, we didn't even have quantity. So there's no doubt but as Bhagavath pointed out, the precociousness of India's development story, and that we argue was one of the implications of early universal franchise, was that distributional things through welfare got first priority before laying the foundation of public goods. And even now, which city can you walk on footpaths? Hardly any city has. Poor people walk, rich people drive. Yet, which city invests even the modest amounts to build just decent footpaths that poor people can walk on? So I think there are lots of implications which I'm going to turn to Arvind.
I just want to sort of, look, I think we should be, honest in acknowledging that very poor public good provision earlier, and it was in the era of rapid growth that health, education, and in the last 10, 15 years, the whole push to what we call new welfare, the achievements on cooking gas, on open defecation, on drinking water, bank accounts, power. These have improved enormously in the last 20 years, especially in the last 10, 15 years. Of course, the claims made by the government are maybe in excess of the achievement, but the achievements have been significant. And remember, some of these things like the chula, this, that, the other, are what in the 70s we development economists thought of as basic, essential goods. So, and more broadly, it's in the era of rapid growth. So, just to provoke Ram a little bit, it's the neoliberal state that became the social welfare state and the caring state, as it were, unlike in the past. That's point one. I think we should acknowledge that. But what has happened in the last 4 or 5 years is politicians have discovered one particular toy, as it were, which is cash transfers. Now, I think we should be fairly honest about this. Devesh Partho Mukhopadhyay and I first wrote about the benefit of cash transfers, and as CA also, I pushed along this universal basic income thing. And at some level, I do think a cash transfer can provide that basic minimum, especially if it's targeted at women and so on. I think it does provide that cushion. Mostly, to me, the appeal of these universal basic income and cash transfers were really about, alleviating some of the cognitive and psychological burden that came from poverty and destitution. But what has happened in the last 5 years is that it's become a toy. It's a toy that's actually very easy to use, because the great virtue of cash transfers is you do it today, it goes into the account tomorrow. So politicians can claim that they've done something that they promised and they can take credit for it. So what has happened, especially with cash transfers, is that we have a kind of new social compact between the citizens and the state. The citizens say, you're not going to improve the quality of education that Devesh was saying. Maybe you're not going to improve the quality of child stunting, for example. And there are no guarantees that you do, so we might as well accept the cash transfer up front. In turn, I think the subtler point is that many state governments have kind of acknowledged that, or rather abdicated on their responsibilities. So for them, they can't do the difficult things, they give you cash transfers instead. So there's a kind of holy alliance between the citizen and the state. Now, in this form of the proliferating cash transfer, there is a serious worry. It's a worry because it's being done without eliminating more wasteful forms of intervention, like fertilizer subsidies or power subsidy. These are come in addition to that. And they become the currency of competitive populism. Devesh gives 1,000, I promise 2,000, Rahul promised 5,000, and so the escalator goes on. And in the long run, it spells a disaster or potentially serious things for the fiscal situation for states, and therefore for the ability of the state to provide all those other things that are required to improve the quality of lives, as it were, for the poorest Indians and for everyone in general.
Be a contribution to the discourse and language. It contains very many things, and as I said, it's a fascinating concept as it is.
But I think somewhere in your argument you did say that the absence of macro violence is because of the precautiousness of democracy, and which is a great thing. Why are we viewing democracy and the precautions of democracy? I don't understand. Because I think it's a very bold decision which the early governments have made, that representation of the people is more important than, is the first priority. It's more important. It's the first priority. And I think that is what, over the last 75 years, we have seen that somewhere people feel that they are represented. I have another argument saying that wherever there has been a coalition government, India has done very well. Both the 1990s liberalization, the Vajpayee government, the UPA government. So this has happened because of the people feel represented and they are better viewed. So I would argue that it is democracy which is causing growth, and the China way of denying rights is not something which we chose to do. So why don't we say that we do not want to imitate China, but we want to traverse our own path? There is no great hurry for that. If it takes another 50 years, so what? Is that the right way to look at it?
So look, which India was very distinct. The book then looks at the consequences of that choice, amongst which is this. So our focus is on the consequences of the choice, rather than the normative content of that choice, and meaning the economic consequences. I know it's fashionable to say that under coalition governments we do. Actually, that is only sometimes. We are cherry picking. Under the Janata government, 78 to 80, that didn't happen. It led to a huge issue that led to the 1980-81 IMF program, which was the largest, because they did not take corrective efforts as the macroeconomic. The 91 crisis, that whole thing happened because of the two coalition governments. The Chandrasekhar government was probably one of the most corrupt governments and one of the most inept governments that led to that macroeconomic crisis. In fact, the second UPA, the amount of corruption in that is what was a factor for certain that led to the elections of 2014 and the different outcome. So, you're right that there have been periods when coalition governments have delivered much better, but there have also been periods when they delivered much worse. So there is no unequivocal thing that coalition governments are better. The evidence simply does not support that.
So, on the first point, Vikram, see, I think, when we spoke about the abiding irony, what we say in that is, and this is again in the spirit of just acknowledging the consequences in a positive rather than in a normative sense. I don't think we should also be blind to the fact that democracy did pose some challenges for, development more broadly. Just to give you one example, most famously, all the successful East Asian countries
that became successful. One of the earliest things they did, the two early achievements were land reform and basic education. Now, come to education maybe later, I'll give it to Dinesh. But certainly on land reform, the fact of democracy, and in particular the way the Congress party functioned, especially the fact that they were close to, in fact, comprised of the landed elites in the states, certainly came in the way of broader land reform. So, and that was a serious, we paid a serious cost because of that. The other thing we say in the book is that we have this description of the Indian fiscal state as a Kamadhenu democracy, which is that, see, if you look at, I didn't show you the chart, the Indian fiscal state has been one of the weakest states. Yeah, we can show that. Could I do this? Yeah, okay. So this chart shows what is the fiscal deficit, total fiscal deficit of the government, India and many other comparable emerging market countries. And India has had, during the period of rapid growth, not in the, in the old days of crises and things, in the era of rapid growth, India has had the highest fiscal deficit, which means its ability to tax has been limited, its willingness to spend has been unlimited. So the question is, why is this the case? And one answer that we give is that the Indian state, and because of democracy and the multitudinous interests, sometimes the beauty of democracy is that, every interest stakes a claim, and the Indian state, like Kamadhenu, suckles all of them very generously. So, and that is the consequence of the Indian democracy angle. And I just want to read out just something we quote from the book. Is I.G. Patel, the wise man, who says, this is a kind of, we're trying to just reinforce what we say about how democracy has led to a weakening of the Indian fiscal state. He says, I suspect the divisive character of Indian society, the need to preserve the Indian Federation, the workings of a parliamentary democracy where 100 and even 1,000 flowers have to be allowed to bloom, all lead to a kind of eclectic melange where every policy of special pleading found a place. So democracy has been an equal opportunity vested interest creator, facilitator, sustainer. And this is an important point to recognize because traditional versions of India and vested interest, especially books by Pranab Bharatan, very excellent, influential book, saying, oh, there are three big vested interests in India. This politicians, bureaucrats, or whatever, big business. But actually what we show, of course, there are some very influential pampered classes in India. By the way, the number one pampered class in India are government employees. Probably number two are farmers. But the point is that it is not about just a few special interests. Democracy has, laid a claim to all manner of special interests to plead and to find accommodation in the Indian fiscal state. Just add clear-eyed that there have been costs to democracy. And if we are not clear-eyed about that, we will not be able to strengthen it. You can't have a democracy without elections. You cannot have elections without money. We know, even if you spend $1 per person for elections, that's $1 billion expenditure right there. That's only for parliament. State elections, and 3 million local elected officials. All of those require money. That money needs to be raised. And we know that a big part of the sources of corruption is the need to raise electoral finance. There is simply no doubt about it. Now, there are lots of things, how do you deal with it? You can see it, how that's really led to a weakening of democracy in the US, right? The Supreme Court decision on that. But I think democracies have struggled. How do you manage the reality that elections are costly? In fact, the stronger your democracy, and one measure is strong electoral competition, the more competitive your electoral process is, the more money has to be raised. And therefore it's even more corruption. So there are aspects of which we have to think through. This is not to say, all democracy is a problem, but to say there are aspects of it that do lead to issues that they need to fix. Let me just add on this election point. Again, a data point from India. And again, please don't draw any conclusions on what it implies for one nation, one vote, etc. That's a whole different thing we don't get into. But here's what we found looking at Indian elections. Between 1950 and 1980, the average gap between any elections in India was about 4.5 to 5 years, because anyway, it happened every 5 years. But once the synchronization went, and then when the 1973rd and 74th Amendment came in, today the average gap between elections is just what? 1 year or just over 1 year. So almost every year there's an election. So Devesh's point about therefore you need to raise money, etc., actually gets magnified. The other thing that happens with this narrowing window of democracy, and I've experienced this while working with state governments, is that the window for reform is literally 6 months to 9 months, because and I've experienced this in the last 2 years. Property taxes, which are very low, have to be increased. The Panchayat election is coming up in 6 months. The Panchayat election happens, property tax should be increased, or the urban local body election is coming up. So the window of thing, and this is intrinsic to democracy. And again, Devesh said, it's not something that we would say should therefore be otherwise, but we have to be clear-eyed about what the costs it imposes as well.
On a different question, Ram Rajan spoke at once. On that day, the stream was not available, so we had to do it in a hall. And he said that India is choosing a wrong path by pursuing manufacturing, whereas it should have been pursuing what its core strength is, which is services. Now, we find Telangana rising, which is 5.5 lakh crores of manufacturing. Are we going the wrong path? And what did you say in your book, or what's your opinion?
See, we don't say, we don't take on, it's. But let me say 2 or 3 things, kind of obvious things about this, right? One is that the kind of, services firstly is a catch-all for many activities. But I think what Raghu and Rohit had in mind is that we have a lot of talent, and therefore we should emphasize more these high-skilled services going forward, because we have things. And then the simple, I think, cautionary note on that is, any definition of high-skilled services, no matter how generous you are in the definition, will provide jobs to about 1 to 2% of the labor force. So, as a strategy for inclusive development, emphasizing that cannot be assumed. Second is that the only pathway we know that other countries have done for successful development is through low-skill manufacturing first, and over time we do more high-skill activities. Now, India was never able to do that, and we paid the price, enormous price for that. And why we couldn't do that, we address in the book. But the point is that going forward with the China Plus One opportunity, we got one more chance to kind of do manufacturing, and reflected the fact that before the Trump tariffs, the Trump tariffs have thrown a spanner in the wheels, and we can talk about that. But before that happened, India was, especially the southern states like Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Andhra, were beginning to attract labor-intensive manufacturing. Apple had famously located, and Apple providing lots of jobs to, especially to women. All these things. So female labor force employment was going to happen. Now, the retort that would come back is, and which comes back is, that the world will never absorb another China, so the manufacturing thing cannot work for India. My answer to that is, the numbers that we gave, China occupied 45 to 50% of global exports. We are occupying 3 to 4%. We will never go from 3 to 4 to even 25. But this opportunity could potentially, if we do things right,
allow us to go from 3 to 4 to 12, 13, whatever, 14. And even that can be very significant. And even that can be significant even though robots and all that is coming in will reduce the employment potential of that. So we need to emphasize or try and do some low-skill manufacturing because the potential, while it's not as big as it was for China or as big as it could be because of robotics, it still could be very significant. And remember, most of these low-skill jobs are in apparel. 80% of jobs are women. In Foxconn factories, 80% of jobs are women. So this is not only going to provide employment up to a limited extent, but female employment with all the positive consequences, for gender equality and gender issues.
I think I fundamentally disagree. So, I fundamentally disagree for several reasons. One, if you are 1/6 of humanity, given your development challenges, you want to have every arrow in your quiver, right? You want to try everything. You don't want to say, oh, not this, not this. It could be that, yes, certain states might go services, some states might go tourism to Canada, let's say. Some states might do more manufacturing, some states might do more skill-intensive manufacturing, some might do more labor-intensive manufacturing. Remember, our 28 plus states are larger than most countries in the world. And to say that India should not do manufacturing, especially at a time of such global insecurity. And we are seeing how the countries are now using that if you need a certain product, they can hold you hostage. So forget national security implications. But for a pure development objective, you need to fire on all cylinders. Why do you want to reduce that? I just don't understand.
Last question. Restless when you said that South is not subsidizing UP Bihar, but actually it's West and Haryana.
No, just be careful. Please don't misquote me and misquote us here. What we said was the South is not the biggest. It is got giving more than it's contributing to the tax kitty. It's just that you would think from the noise that it was the biggest donor, and it's not. So just be careful.
Okay, that itself I'm sure many of us believe that we are the biggest donor, and you have clarified that point. But when will this catch-up happen? When will we stop discussing that we are contributing to? Then we are discussing whether we are the same country or we are different countries. The transfer of states. Why can't they solve this problem in a finance commission where it's more, what shall I say, sensible and rational, so these states, South and the West, stop complaining that they are subsidizing UP Bihar. But do you see a time frame for this?
See, firstly, I think two or three things to note, right? One, of course, is that a lot of this is also happening in the context of delimitation and smoothing. I think that's an elephant in the room, that the fear of the southern states is the following: that if delimitation goes ahead and says one person, one vote, as democracy should be, and simultaneously that this transference continues, then their fear is they will lose out on both counts. So that's kind of one fear. And of course, the obvious solution to that is that if you go, the compromise could be if you go with one person, one vote, then you start, not eliminating, but gradually reducing the transfers. So that would be one kind of compromise that could be struck. But I think there are two other elephants in the room which are, I think, the deeper determinants of this thing, right? One is, if underlying performance doesn't converge or begin to converge, these things will always be there. It will always be the case that you say, oh, they're not doing well, and you continue to think. So some measure of convergence in underlying economic performance has to happen for these things to go away permanently. The last point I would say is that the noise from the south is also related to other things that are happening on federalism more broadly, not just fiscal federalism. Whether it's language or the sense of over-centralization or the sense that some languages are being imposed. So I think it is as much a product of the broader political context and the broader issues of over-centralization, majority party, which is pushing language, etc. I think is the broader thing. And again, if that is not addressed, or rather, if that were not the case, all these demands would either be articulated, there would be less discontent, or even if they are articulated, they would be articulated with a sense that these are not insurmountable problems. Through negotiation and compromise, they can be achieved. So there are big elephants in the room, which I think are the deeper things that are determining what things you say.
So one thing to clarify, the largest transfer which we have, order of magnitude, is to Jammu and Kashmir and the Northeast. Now, should that be the case? And we know that there are larger national security reasons why that's the case. But you could ask, is that also sort of infinite? How long should that be? And is that actually making it harder to integrate rather than the opposite? Because if I know that I can behave badly and you're going to write checks, why should I stop? Right? So that's one more. I think there are a range of difficult questions the country will have to grapple. Take the delimitation. We know that fertility rate in the south is less relatively. If you believe that democracy fundamentally requires the weight of the vote of every citizen should be same, the weight of a voter in the south has been much higher and has been increasing in the past 50 years since the historical compromise of the early 1970s. Right? Per parliamentary seat in the south, there are fewer voters. Now, one way this could be addressed, and is happening, is migration. Right? And we know that how much migration is happening. But the South is not happy with that. As you saw, different states have said we should have a higher fertility rate. So there is this awkwardness that somehow it's almost the same what Europeans or Americans think about international migration, that our national identity is going to be adversely affected. We also believe that if too many people from, this began with the Shiv Sena in Maharashtra in the 70s, but we don't think that if someone from Rajasthan came and settled in Tamil Nadu, that even after 3, 4, 5 generations, that person is still not Tamilian. He's still Rajasthani, right? Because we still have not come and grasped and dealt with that if you are one nation of migration, a movement of people, you can equalize population. There's no reason why the South will have fewer people. In fact, it can have more people, but it doesn't want that to, it wants just like the US, the MAGA crowd wants to protect national identity. There are elements also there. So there are hard questions on all sides that have to be dealt with. And that is where you require political wisdom, the spirit of compromise. That is the only way to resist it.
So I think just to maybe a little bit nuance what Devesh is saying on migration, I think to be fair, the southern states, I think, are happy with and de facto, you do see a lot of migration, have seen a lot of migration into the southern states. And so far, at least, there have not been major problems of nativism, etc. So I think the problem one has to prepare for is that it could reach a tipping point beyond which it's found to be societally, politically unacceptable. Now, where I would slightly disagree with Devesh is that I think the sense of who is you count amongst yourself is something that you cannot change. It's something that up to a point you have to accept. Just as people say internationally, the logic for migration control is, we as citizens have the right to determine who is in and who is out. I think obviously it should not be in as extreme a form as within a country because after all we're one nation. But the fact that there are these regional identities means that at some point people that will start asserting itself. So instead of I think saying that wow, why are we not a nation that, why can't I live happily with Devesh as a Tamilian with the Punjabi next to me? I think what we should do is try and maximize the benefits facilitated while preparing for some of the challenges that will happen going forward.
Thank you. This is a very personal question. 40%, and someone else said that it's because they changed the base of the inflator or something. I see many of your charts, and I'm curious to know how do you handle that data? One, two, how do you handle data when we didn't have a census in 2010?
So on the book itself, I think most of the data is historical, and most of the historical data we think are broadly reliable. And what we make an effort in the book is we try and whatever data we have that we present, we try and cross-check it from multiple sources. So that's the sense in which I think we try, and we've been very careful about that. I mean, to be honest, every number in the book has been, checked with 2, 3, 4 other things. Now, but you're asking the other question. I mean, of course, if you have unreliable data, it's going to complicate, many things. For example, just to give you one example, when I was in government, the numbers, the growth rates were quite high. And I remember we had this discussion on whether there should be a fiscal stimulus. At that time, my colleagues and I had diagnosed that there was a twin balance sheet problem in India, banks were not lending, and therefore we said there should be a fiscal stimulus because we needed to revive the economy. And there was a fierce debate within the government, and finally my side of the argument lost. Because ultimately the other side came back and said, what are you talking about? If you don't do this, we're still growing at 7.5%. So what's the need to think? And the same thing happened on the urgency of reforms. I remember telling Mr. Jaitley that, A, B, C, D, we need to push much stronger because the economy is not, firing on all cylinders. And when he would present it to others, they would come back and say, what is the CA talking about? We're growing at 8.5%. So I think it's a serious problem. It's really like driving a car without a rear view mirror or even a front mirror. But I would just say that this is a problem again that's afflicting a lot of economies around the world. Not just India, China also, and most seriously the United States. Today, the United States does not have the latest GDP number, the latest employment number, the latest inflation number. And they're going to have to make policy based on that. So again, it seems to be the broader trend towards illiberalism. One of the casualties of that seems to be unreliable data.
So one of the things is, for instance, while we didn't have the census, right, the consequences, of course not good. But what also happened last, say, quarter century, we had the NFHS, the National Family Health Survey, and that was an independent, excellent source of data for some variables. I think we should also note, it is true that we normally think of data, macro data, center, but we tend to ignore that there's quite a bit of data that should be gathered by states and the states being forfeit are terrible. I mean, take the most basic data that the states should have done years ago, which is births and deaths. That's the most basic. Even now, many states have a sample registration system, not a complete one, right? Now, I think we tend to forget that so many variables, the data actually comes to the center from the states. So most of the data, almost all on law and order, comes from states. Some states don't report them on some of these because it will give them, and we know that crime data that comes from the states is often just junk, right? So I think we should also ask these hard questions, not just for the center, but also the states.
I mean, most famously, our COVID data were showed that I was a little bit involved in saying that the numbers were death numbers were vastly understated. I think that had serious consequences for all kinds of things. How people perceive the magnitude of the problem, the policy response, and in that case, these were really things that involved millions of lives. And it turns out that it's gone unnoticed or under the radar that a few months ago, data finally came out on that period. And I don't mean to gloat at all, but the numbers that we suggested, we estimated were pretty close to, it was like more like 4 million deaths rather than 500,000 or 1 million. But that's a kind of serious data error. But of course, there, there it's not necessarily a capacity problem, like what Dinesh was referring to for the states. There's a huge capacity problem there. But then it was also a case of, politically not wanting to acknowledge the.
Yeah.
Essentially, that state's human development gives you a sense of its broader development, success or strategy. But I do think that, yes, there is a big lag between the Hindi belt and the south. But take something like fertility. We now know, which we wouldn't have thought 5-10 years ago, UP's fertility rate is now coming below the replacement level, right? Which, and as India's biggest state, this was something that UP Bihar was seen as, and the broader Rajasthan MP as much higher fertility. But even now we see the Bihar is still lagging, but even the large Hindi states, their fertility levels have fallen quite sharply. Now, of course, that will transcend into, for instance, in these states, for the first time, the number of school-going children has peaked. So for the first time, the problem is not about enrollment, but about thinking about learning outcomes. So there is a lag that happens. I think there's a much greater consciousness, even in these states, about the backwardness. Whether this translates in 10, 20 years to better development outcomes, I hesitate to say. But I don't think that I would be as weak as I might have been a decade ago. The changes occurring in the north are perceptible, though, as you rightly said, there's a long way to go.
I think the question was, if I may interpret your question slightly differently, what the future, I think it may turn out to be different from the past. I don't know. But remember, the reason for the fiscal transfers was precisely that the access to public services and public spending should not be too different across this country. That a citizen in Uttar Pradesh could have similar access. That was the logic of the transfer, right? So, when in fact it didn't happen, in fact the divergence in the human development, that only reinforced the sense of moral hazard. That, here we are, we transferred all this money, and yet we didn't get the human development outcomes, which was the, because remember, the purpose of the transfers is not growth or, the divergent performance. It was, broadly equal access to public services, and especially fiscal services, publicly financed services. And the fact that it didn't happen, I think, just reinforces the sense of moral hazard, even more than divergent economic performance. So if that improves going forward, I think some of these things will go away. But in the past, I think that has only reinforced the sense of moral hazard and kind of the unfairness or the ineffectiveness of these transfers.
The decision for universal franchise was made with the Motilal Nehru report in 1928. So it was done much before sort of independence, and there was simply no question about it. Surely it was a strong elite preference, that's clear in the report. Now, to what extent it was based on mass movements which were reversed at that time because of Gandhi. I think the sense one has, and I don't want to claim expertise because our book is not about pre-independence, it's about after independence, was that the mass movements played into elite preferences, but were surely not the only driver, because elites would still have found ways to subvert it, and we know around the world they've always found it. So to say it's both is perhaps not answering your question fully, but that's my understanding. I think the decentralization part, most countries were actually not very centralized to begin with. I think in the constitution, there was a general sensibility towards centralization. Tier 3 was not given, not paid enough attention. The only person who was thinking much more about Tier 3 was Gandhiji. But then he was, of course, out of the picture pretty soon. And we know that if you look at the 73rd, but the 74th Amendment in particular, that has basically been sabotaged by the states in all forms. So we actually argue in the book that everything the center does badly, the states do worse. In almost every institutional form, universities, finance commissions, election commissions, you can take a range of institutions. So we should not sort of think that decentralization is a panacea. But I think particularly when it comes to local public goods, you need much greater decentralization and that's the argument.
So the experience between the first and the second tier is that Devesh said, everything the center did badly, especially the public good provision. Whether you take the state finance commissions, the public service commissions, the judiciary, they've almost always. And I think there is a broader lesson here, which is that somehow accountability mechanisms have been much weaker. And take legislatures, for example. If you think Parliament is not meeting enough, if you look at the quality and the duration of state legislatures, it's much worse. So decentralization as a panacea, be careful about. But where I slightly disagree with Devesh is that, but then that extends also to the third tier. Don't think just because you decentralize to the third tier, therefore it will be a panacea. Because there is one logic that has been expressed repeatedly in several taxation reports that were written. The closer you are to the people, the more difficult it is to tax, because you don't want to be seen as inflicting, these onerous burdens on the people. So again, even first to second experience is kind of at best mixed. But then to think that it's a leap of faith, say no, but if you go to the third, somehow it will be better. That one has to be a little bit careful about.
Good evening, sir. This is Pradeep Kumar. You have shown so much of data, it's wonderful. But I would like to know whether you could quantify the impact of corruption as because it has an impact. It has an effect on the growth or what it is. I would like to know that. That's what I want to say.
Uh, See, by definition and all over the world, corruption is going to be difficult to measure precisely because its corruption happens, under the radar, under the thing, and therefore quantification is going to be quite difficult. I leave the election quantification to Devesh, but in fact, in the book, we have two kind of proxies for corruption, macro proxies for corruption. So, if you think about it broadly, and I'm generalizing a little bit, in the first 30 years, we had corruption that arose from scarcity. License Raj, things were not enough, and so the allocation of scarcity is what created the corruption. In the growth era, it became slightly different. Rapid growth interacted with kind of limited resources, which then created corruption. As we know, when there's rapid growth, licenses become very valuable, land becomes very valuable, coal becomes very valuable, and so the nature of corruption changes over time between a scarcity era and a growth era. So in the book, for the scarcity era, we have a measure of corruption, which is what is the black market premium on the exchange rate. And you find that it broadly tracks, the scarcity and the liberalization very well. And on average, it's about 40-45% over that period. I mean, that's not to say corruption was 40-45%, but a broad sense of the magnitude. And then we compare it with other countries like China, and you get somewhat, plausible results. The other measure of corruption that we have in the book is show the data on what fraction of GDP was reported to the tax authorities as income. So again, that shows you, if you have an economy, how much is reported to tax authorities. This gives you a sense of what is the hidden economy as well. And actually, from the 1950s to today, it does show an increase from about 5% of the GDP is reported to tax authorities, and today it's something like 34-35%. Now, so in a relative sense, corruption, how much is hidden from the tax authorities has come down. But if you look at those magnitudes, that is, what is 5% then and 35% today, in absolute terms, the unreported amounts have increased enormously, showing again in absolute terms what the potential scope for corruption could be. So these are numbers that we should have in the book.
Yeah.
Sure. No doubt that people say by far the most corruption is in the South. There's absolutely no doubt in magnitude the extent of corruption in the South. The South is also richer. When China grew, the most spectacular growth story, China has been extremely corrupt. When the US grew massively in the second half of the 20th century, it was massively corrupt. So, easy lessons, whether it's corruption, entrepreneurship. After all, West Bengal grew a lot because it was able to attract people from all over India, right? Maharashtra grew, Bombay, because there were people who were entrepreneurs, again, who came from all over India. So, to say that the South or place X is entrepreneurial doesn't take into account that entrepreneurs, like in the US, there's so many Indian Americans doing well because they have migrated. One of the advantages of migration is you attract the talent. Right? It's not just labor, you attract talent as well. Any city like Hyderabad or Bangalore is growing rapidly because it's able to attract talent in a way that, say, Calcutta used to do till, say, the 1970s. Right? So I think what I want to say is that when we think of entrepreneurship and culture, we take too much, and we should not draw lessons about the future or the past simply from what we see success or failures happening right now.
But I agree with everything they said, but I think your question was whether it was society or the state. I think there is no doubt, however, that especially Kerala and Tamil Nadu, the fact that they had early social reform movements from the bottom up had an important role to play in breaking down some of the kind of rigid barriers of caste, which in turn led to better human development outcomes, etc. And certainly that is a distinguishing feature of at least Karnataka, Tamil Nadu and Kerala, to some extent other southern states, from the Hindi heartlands, where these bottom-up reform movements, i.e. the reform movements from society as it were, they have not happened to the same extent, but of course, as Devesh said, things will change, and so there are some things that happened in the past that have an impact, but through action by state and society over time, these things can change. But I think the social reform movements in the South were critical to how they've done, in the long run, as it were.
They don't have the power to collect taxes and be independent. They are dependent on the state and center for funds. And adding to that, the horizontal distribution of the income revolution in Financial Commission, it draws arguments regarding to de-incentivize the states promoting population control as well as forest ecology promotion. What would be better parameters for distribution as per horizontal distribution among the states?
I'll take the horizontal distribution from what I have been working. The horizontal devolution formula, in my view, should be very simple. It should have just two variables. It should say states should get back broadly what they contributed. That's one parameter. And second one should be, however you depart from this based on need, as it were, whether it's poverty or whatever should be done. What successive finance commission, and this is typical of policy making in India more generally, that we keep adding, every finance commission adds its own pet, forest cover, population control. This is not a mechanism for social engineering more broadly. This is just, and so it should be based on a simple rule which says what you contribute you get back, but because we want everyone to have equal access to services, we should have a redistribution component. What the weight should be, that's something that should be decided over time, but it should be kept simple to, what you contribute you get back, subject to some redistribution, and then over time you have to take a call on how much redistribution there should be. That should be, in my view, the simplest way, and this is what I've advocated as well. The formulas are getting too complicated and I think messy, which again I think obscures what should be the purpose of horizontal devolution.
I think we really underestimate the degree to which local governments underutilize the fiscal powers that they have. Take the most basic fiscal power that local governments have, which is property taxes, land and property. We know just how much land and property prices are escalating. Every local government refuses or does trivial for property taxes. So one of numerous studies show that local governments severely do not want to raise and tax on the ground that Arvind had pointed out earlier. The closer you are to people, the less you want to tax. So while you're right that their fiscal powers are also quite constrained, but even within those constraints, they do not utilize even the limited powers that they have.
So just to build on what Devesh said, two things to say. Remember, if you compare the revenue raising of urban local bodies and rural bodies, the rural bodies do better than the urban bodies, by the way. And part of the reason is that rural bodies just don't have that big source of rent and corruption, which is land. Because urban land is so valuable, it becomes a source of contention, and that's why state governments get very involved in that. So what Devesh is absolutely right, within the scope you could raise more, but because land, there's so much money, state politicians, etc. In rural things, land is not a big issue, it's not so important, and state governments don't interfere, and therefore they do end up doing better on revenue raising than urban local bodies.
3 to 4 decades, while our politicians seem to think it's an endless rabbit hole. Trends also suggest the opposite. In light of Raghuram Rajan's comments and broader support for this point of view,
What is support for what point of view?
that India should focus on services rather than manufacturing.
We've answered that question.
Yes, sir. But my question is, how would this ideological pivot affect India's ability to escape the middle income trap? And I know you cleverly sidestepped recommendations to steer clear of controversies, but I would still like to ask you, how should our social security evolve to ensure that it doesn't crack or possibly collapse due to this demographic shift?
So we are nowhere close to the middle income trap. Let's get to middle income, upper middle income, and then we can talk about a trap. So no discussion of middle income trap now. We are still quite a poor economy. In dollar terms, 2,500. In PPP terms, $6,000. Still poor. Let's get to 5,000, 7,000, 8,000, and then let's reconvene. So don't get into this middle income trap idea for India. We are far away from that.
I mean, the same thing applies on the demographic dividend. We have by the time it peaks, whatever, 2050, 2060, by that time at least Harvind and I are dead. And so, there's way enough time to think about what we need to think the next 5, 10, 15 years without having to worry a generation like from now. If you do things well now, that will take care of itself.
And the other thing to remember is the demographic dividend is an opportunity, not a necessity or inevitability. Between a population that's young, converting it into a dividend requires providing employment opportunities, etc., etc. So the demographic dividend is not something that you have a divine right to. You have to earn the demographic dividend.
We back at MANTHAN before we graduate to the middle income.
Happily. So you don't want us to come for a long time.
Much before that. Thank you very much for the very thoughtful presentation and wonderful questions you had. Thank you. May I request Sujata to give the lecture to the audience, please.
I thought just to remove the Mahabharata when who comes running and says, "I have a gift," and I think the Kunti says, "Share the gift."
Yes.
So that's how you get to polyandry in the Mahabharata. So this is we shared without polyandry.
Thank you very much. Those of you who bought the book, authors are here to sign and including me.